Puedo escribir los versos más tristes esta noche. Escribir, por ejemplo, la noche está estrellada y tiritan azules los astros a lo lejos.
So, Edie, here we are. Do I introduce myself? I can.
Yeah.
Adam Feinstein.
So we're here with Adam Feinstein, the biographer of Pablo Neruda.
Here it is. This is the 2013, the second edition, with an extra chapter at the end about the exhumation, the remarkable exhumation of his body that year, which is still to produce the findings of whether he was actually poisoned in hospital in 1973. We do not know, but that's for another time. So ask me whatever you like, Edie.
Great. So Chile's main newspaper, El Mercurio, called Nascimento the anonymous hero of 20th century writers. Why do you think that Nascimento achieved what it did in that period, and why did so many writers flock to Nascimento?
I think it has to go down to the man himself. Carlos George-Nascimento had this passion and spirit for producing works of literature, often by unknown writers, bringing them into the public domain. He took risks when other publishers were cautious. Publishing today is incredibly cautious, and I don't think today a publisher would do what Nascimento did back in the 1920s in Santiago in Chile. He took people like Pablo Neruda, put them on board, and said, "Oh, I'm not sure what I think. I'm not necessarily convinced about the quality, but there's something in it. There's something in it. I'm going to take a leap in the dark, put it out there, and let's see." Of course, sometimes he thought, this is magnificent stuff, and let's go with it. Other times he just said, there's a danger that it might flop, but I'm going to gamble. And he was a gambler. Writers like gamblers. Yeah. Writers are gamblers sometimes. I play poker. And writers like publishers to be gamblers. They like to gamble with what they've written. Take a leap in the dark, go for it. And they recognise that. They recognise the enthusiasm. Nascimento wasn't, he arrived not knowing anything about literature, books. He arrived as a clean slate almost in Chile. And he built up the passion, self-taught. And I think writers flocked to him for that reason. They saw a kind of a kindred spirit, someone who could recognise talent and was willing to go with it. So that's why you had the Nerudas and the Parras and the Mistrals coming to his door and saying, "Please publish me." And it really worked out well. You could see it worked out well. Yeah. And that's I think is the overall.
So that sort of
spirit.
Explains why Neruda came to him with his first books, but why? What made their relationship last so long throughout Neruda's life? Why did he keep?
Well, it was his second. Of course, it was his second book, the 20 Love Poems and Song of Despair after Crepusculario. But it is the one that made his name. Remember, it sold 1 million copies by 1961 and 2 million by 1971. We're talking huge figures. The biggest selling book of Spanish language.
Do you know how many he sold worldwide?
Well, it was worldwide. They were the figures from 1971. Right. I have no idea what it is now. We're talking multi-millions. No one's made a count. It'd be too many to calculate. So he's. What was the question again? Sorry.
So what made their relationship so long-lasting?
Well, they got on well. You have to say that there was the first few books. He published 3 books of Neruda's in 1 year. That's an extraordinary thing for publishers to do. I mean, today that's unheard of, unless you're Barbara Cartland or something. But I mean, 3 books of quality in 1 year, no publisher would do today. We're talking about 1926. Yeah. So we're talking about El Habitante de Esperanzas, is the book, his short story, a novella. Anillos, which is the book of poems that he wrote with his friend Tomás Lago. And Tentativa del Hombre Infinito. So, Tentativa del Hombre Infinito, which was this very strange avant-garde long poem, really, without punctuation.
Wow.
All published in 1926. None of them have been, well, one of them has just been translated into English for the first time. So he went with those. I mean, as I say, unique, I think, even to this day, to have a publisher publish 3 great or very important works by not an enormously well-known, despite the 20 love poems, who did make his name. You know, he was taking a risk. So that was what happened. Then he, and then of course he published Nascimento, the Residencia en la Tierra, one of the great books of poems of the 20th century. Later in life, there was a period where he wanted to have a wider readership internationally across Latin America, and he turned to a Buenos Aires Argentinian publisher called Losada, who published many of his works in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and even the posthumous work. But even amongst those, Neruda came back to Nascimento for some remarkable books. He published Las Uvas del Viento, which is not his best book, but it's actually got a lot of interesting stuff. And then he published this beautiful edition of the Oda a la Tipografía, Ode to Typography, which just one poem, with on the front cover, designed by Mauricio Amster. Mauricio Amster was one of the men he saved on the Winnipeg.
Right.
Remember, Winnipeg was this little boat, fishing boat that Neruda chartered in 1939, in August 1939, and he got 2,300 refugees from Franco who escaped across the border into southern France. He shipped them out on this tiny little fishing boat that's stinking of cod from Bordeaux, a 1 month journey out to Valparaiso in Chile. And one of the people on that, as I say, was Mauricio Amster, who became this typographer and this artist, graphic artist, and produced this extraordinary cover for this book, which Nascimento had the enormous imagination to publish in the 50s, and Neruda went straight to him. That was it. Nascimento was his first choice. Was his first choice to publish the book, and it's a beautiful edition. It's the first edition here in London, I believe, in the British Library. Anyone who lives in London should definitely flock to it. Certainly the first edition in the Universidad de Chile in Santiago. So he always came back to Nascimento. Always felt loyal to him. Nascimento died in 1966, didn't he? And so after that, Neruda turned to Losada for the last few years of his life, his own life. He only died in 1973. So when Neruda returned to Chile, he was made ambassador. President Allende appointed him ambassador in Paris, 1970. He was there for 2 years, but his health was progressively deteriorating, so he returned to Chile in the end of 1972. But that year, he did come back to Nascimento and publish some of these delightful small books, small editions, but beautifully produced. Jewels, I would say jewels. Yes. Total jewels. And Aún, of course. Aún is a masterpiece. Tiny little book. Impossible to translate a title. It just means still, or yet again, or yet, or still. A beautiful book, which Neruda is one of his great late books, and he chose Nascimento to publish it, rather than go to Losada, who publishes the bigger work. So he did feel that Nascimento and he were a team.
Yeah, and wasn't Nascimento there financially for him as well? He sent him funds for his famous house in
That's right, isn't it? In his name, that's right. he would not have been able to buy the house at Isonegro without Nascimento's generously lending us some money.
And Felipe Reyes, the biographer of Nascimento, said that he also dedicated the house to Nascimento, and that there aren't any plaques bearing testimony to him.
I know that's true, but I wish he'd written it down. I don't think there's anywhere that I'm sure it's true. Why would he not? I just wish he'd written it down or said it somewhere, written down or had a plaque or something. Right. I don't think there was anything. I mean, I think a bit of the money came from his wife Delia, the Carril, who was this rich aristocratic communist. Quite a few of those in Argentina. So some of the money came from that, but a lot of it did come from Nascimento, who put that. I'm sure he didn't sign a contract. I can't believe Nascimento signed a contract for that. He didn't sign a contract for some of the books, so it probably went through. He slipped a few pesos, and the house was his. Yeah, and it's a wonderful house.
So there were only 9 people at Neruda's wake.
The wake was tiny.
And so Elena was one of the people.
That's an interesting thing itself, that she felt close enough, or the family felt close enough to allow her in. Yeah. To allow her in to be one of the 9 members. That actually is an interesting thing, an interesting fact. And then when it got out, and people just heard that he was, everyone knew he died. Everyone knew the date of the funeral, 25th September 1973. And people started to follow. They saw the cortege coming out of the house, and they followed it to the cemetery. And then that's when it grew into this massive, great protest. Yeah. It was the first public protest against Pinochet. And then, as they went along towards the General Cementerio General in Santiago, people lined the streets. And then when they got to the cemetery, it was this extraordinary. It's been filmed by Swedish TV. You can watch it on YouTube. Pablo Neruda, presente. Salvador Allende, presente. It was incredibly moving because, as you'd expect, under Pinochet, the participants were surrounded by a circle of soldiers, heavily armed, and they, at any moment they could have fired. They could have opened fire on the. They weren't really protesters. They were just expressing their support for the people they loved. One of them was Neruda, Allende, who obviously just died. And it was a remarkable public demonstration against the junta and support for the deposed, the first democratically elected Marxist president, Allende, anywhere in the world. And it's an extraordinary thing.
Well, going back to the start of his career, I noticed at the start of your book you said that Nascimento was first reluctant to publish Neruda, but in one of the scenes from the film Oliveira de Santiago about Nascimento, Rosalena Marquez encourages or says that that he should publish young Neruda.
Yeah.
So is that true?
Well, he was the one. I think that was the one he was thinking about. I think that was. Yeah, he was reluctant.
What was he reluctant about?
Well, they are very unusual. They are very, very strange poems, the 20 Love Poems. In 1924, no one was writing like that. No one was writing these. They're incoherent. They're very obscure. No one understood them. I don't think Neruda understood them. I mean, and when I translate them, what you've got to do is try and capture the inarticulacy of the verse. Because they were written at a time when Neruda was living through this protracted post-adolescence, when he was trying to find his way. He was having all these sexual relationships in his Bohemian student time in Santiago in the 1920s, but they weren't satisfying him, and that comes through in the poetry. Right. So he's reaching out, he's trying to communicate to a woman, trying to find his way towards a satisfying, erotic and emotional and cerebral connection with women, and he can't find that connection, and that's what's in the poems. Right. But it makes them very difficult to read sometimes, almost impossible to fathom what he's getting at sometimes.
Wow.
So if you, in 1924, if you were a publisher and you picked up that book, manuscript, and you think, who is going to read this stuff? They're going to be completely bewildered. The reader is not going to understand what on earth this is all about. But people saw, enlightened people saw some talent there, saw something, a spark of genius. And they took it on. You've got to bear in mind, ironically, that Neruda himself turned against these poems. He felt they were adolescent, anguished, self-obsessed, sort of feelings in the dark, which they were, feeling his way through the darkness of despair, as it's called, the Song of Despair, the last poem. And he thought poetry, especially after Spain, when he was a consul in Spain, and he saw the horrors of Franco's fascism and particularly the murder of his great friend Federico Garcia Lorca in August 1936. After that, he thought, I shouldn't be writing poems like the 20 Love Poems and Song of Despair, because they're poems, they're not poems to encourage you to live, they encourage you to die, or to feel desperate. It's a song of despair, and so he thought poetry should not do that, it should be life enhancing. And so his poetry completely changed in the 1930s, the late 1930s.
Right, and so why do you think that people are still buying it, still translated? Because
love is bloody awkward. Love is clumsy. If you're in love, or you're trying to get someone to fall in love with you, you are feeling your way in the dark. You're desperate sometimes, especially if that person doesn't show love for you, doesn't show love back. Or, alternatively, they love you and you don't feel the same love. The 20 Love Poems are all about these different combinations of things that can happen, which are all very real. They're all deeply real, and they're universal. They happen to all of us, if we've got a heart at all, which most of us have. I don't know where mine is, somewhere around somewhere around there. But it's, so it speaks to everybody, from whatever class you come. From the working classes, which basically he was. His father was a train driver. He worked on the trains, and but all the way up to the aristocracy. And so today, you find people, lovers all over Latin America, quoting the love poems, 20 Love Poems, and it works. I'm told it works still. They get there. They win over there. The wooing is successful with a quote, because they are magnificent, and even if they're complex and bewildering and obscure and hermetic, that's what love's about. Love isn't something clear cut. It's not love if it's just black and white. That's what Neruda was. That's why he reached something, and it's still translated in extraordinary number of languages. You name a language, it's in that language. Yeah, and it's because it reaches something. It reaches you into the bottom of your soul.
Yeah, and do you think this is why he's sort of reached this label as the world's first rock star poet?
Well,
could you elaborate on how
I do? Well, yes, of course. I mean, the rock star came later. Well, 1945, he gave a reading in Brazil to more than 100,000 people. It was a stadium. It was a football stadium. I mean, that's incredible. A poet to fill a stadium that size, Wembley, size of Wembley. I mean, it's extraordinary because he didn't actually read. You could argue he didn't read his poetry that brilliantly.
Okay.
It had this. It does grow on you, but it has a strange hypnotic voice, nasal voice. But it's just not the writing. It's not the reading style. It's the material. It's the fact that he's talking. He's reaching out to everybody. They recognise themselves in it. And so by the time, the famous case, which I talk about in my biography, of when he went to Peru in 1970s, early 1970s, in Lima. He was giving a recital. He was actually didn't want to read Poema Vente, I can write the saddest lines tonight. He thought, not that. rubbish again. You know, everyone asked me to read that cliche. Don't ask me again. And he refused to read it, but the audience in turn refused to leave the auditorium without him reading it. They just went on strike. And so that's an extraordinary thing to happen to a poet. So he eventually said, "Oh, okay then." And he went, and then they were howling with passionate applause. And then that wasn't the end of it. Then when he got to out to the car park, the audience was waiting for him, and they wouldn't let him leave in his car. They lifted the car off its wheels to stop the car leaving, so they could get one last look at this poet, rock star poet. There are very few today who are like that. I mean, we're talking. Ted Hughes was one, Seamus Heaney, but these have died. You know, for a poet to do that, to create that kind of fanaticism. Yeah. Football fan. They were like football fans. Religion or football fan. Neruda United won. Everyone else nil. I mean, he did that. I mean, of course he enjoyed that. Yeah. He enjoyed the adulation. There's no doubt about it. But that comes from that one book, that Nascimento book. Wow. Written in 1924, the 20 Love Poems, A Song of Despair, published by Nascimento, has gone around the world, and that's the one that people know him by. Even though he would have argued that it wasn't his greatest book. And a lot of people would argue today that Residente in la Tierra has a lot of great, maybe greater, richer poetry in it. Some people would argue. The Canto General, some of the other books, but people keep going back to that book. Because why? Because it speaks from the heart, and it transmits this sense of confused, desperate reaching out for love, which we all have. We all go on having. Basically, for the rest of our lives, we still try and find that, and that's why it's been the book of the 20th century, I think, in Spanish poetry. It's the book of poems which has left a mark on more human beings on this planet than anyone else. And I think Nascimento, Carlos George, would have been very proud if he today to see still that that's the book people turn to, Neruda, to read him and to reach out to Neruda's poetry. It's an extraordinary achievement. You know, and this is a publisher who arrived in Chile from the Azores, you know, out in an island out in the Atlantic it arrived after lots of adventures. It didn't look as though he was ever going to make it. Who knows whether he ever made it? And it's thanks to him that we have Neruda. It is not an exaggeration, because who at that time in the 1920s would have taken the risk? It may be that no one would have published the 20 Love Poems, A Song of Despair in the original Spanish without Carlos George-Nascimento being this gambler, this foolhardy gambler, maybe the foolhardy gambler, but thank goodness he was foolhardy and he took the risk, because there it is, in black and white.
So Neruda published a square version of 20 Love Poems.
He did.
Do you know anything about, why he chose that, and anything about the thought process and the aesthetics of it?
That was incredible whim on his part.
Okay.
It was his second book. He was still very young. He's 20 years old. But he had this whim, his capriciousness, even then. He said, I'm damn going to do things my way. And he said, I insist on it being this odd square format. He liked the feel of it, he liked the look of it, and he said to Nascimento, that's how I wanted it to be. And Nascimento, to his credit, it was a more expensive format. Right. Much more expensive to do it square. But Nascimento, to be honest, I don't know why Nascimento caved in. I'm glad he did, but because it might have been a big obstacle to publishing the book. But he did cave in. He said, "Okay, I'll take the plunge. I'll do it your way, young Pablo," and he did. And it's, of course, now we have the first edition again here in the British Library. Extraordinary, and it is something special. he's right. It does. It stands out. It's a very odd thing for a 20-year-old to be that. Yeah, it was an odd thing about Neruda, a very strange thing. He was very shy and timid, but when he wanted something, he stood up and he got it. So, and you saw that later on when he stood up in the Senate and attacked his own president, González Videla, for turning against the communists, and that, even though he knew that would send him into hiding, and he risked being arrested and being locked up in Pisagua camp, where Pinochet in 1948 was the commandant. Yeah. Pinochet in 1948, and so, but he was willing to take that risk. So he was shy. He always said, there's that wonderful poem in Savagario, 1958, which is one of my favourite of his books, where he called Sobre mi mala educación, or my bad upbringing, where he says, I never know what to do with these public events. I don't know where to put my hands. It's the kind of shyness, timidity which he always had, and his friends always told me that he had. But then, when he wanted something like the square edition of the 20-odd poems, he said, that's what I want. And he set his mind on it. It could drive people mad. That was the kind of spirit he had back in 1924, when he was approaching Carlos George-Nascimento and saying, I'm having a square edition of this or nothing at all, mate. And that's what he said. And he got his way, and thank goodness, because the history would have been very different. Yeah.
Great. So, to finish, what poet would you name as Neruda's heir? Who's?
You know what? They all suffer. All Chilean poets today suffer being under the shadow of Neruda. So none of them they all say they want to get away from his influence. All of them. Raúl Zurita, who's probably the biggest living Chilean poet, I would say. While recognising Neruda's greatness, he always says, people sort of measure us up in where we stand, in Nerudas, as if like some kind of a physical measurement. How many Nerudas can you take? I mean, and it's terrible. It's a weight. And Parra was the first. Nicanor Parra was the first to recognise that back in the 50s. They had who's only just died at 103. Extraordinary. And they had a love-hate relationship, I would say. Although when I met him, Parra, he said, no, he was very generous. Neruda he helped me out. He helped me buy a house, lent me some money to buy a house. But I remember when a journalist asked, they both lived in Isla Negra, near Isla Negra. Parra lived in Las Cruces, Neruda in Isla Negra, basically the same area of Chile. And once a journalist asked Parra, would you consider yourself the greatest poet in Latin America? And he said, well, I'm happy with being the greatest poet in Isla Negra. So a way of getting back at Neruda. So there's no doubt he would. But when I asked Jorge Edwards, the one who was in second command of Neruda at the Paris embassy, and who wrote a wonderful book on Neruda called Adiós Poeta, tremendous book. When I asked him in Oxford quite recently why Parra would talk that way, he said Parra was jealous. Everyone was jealous of Neruda, even Neruda, he said. So even Neruda was jealous of Neruda. So Parra, I can't remember what the question was, but it's a rambling answer here.
Who would you?
Oh yeah, right. Well, I mean, when I say heirs, there are no heirs. The answer is there are no heirs because everyone tries to write differently from him to try and escape from under his influence, under the shadow. Right. So there have been great Chilean poets since. Zurita is a very interesting poet. Enrique Lin, you've got Oscar Hahn. Oscar Hahn's still alive, writing very good poetry. Quite a few others. Gonzalo Roja. These are great poets. These are great poets, not in the same league. You have to say they're not in the same league as Neruda. Parra was a wonderful poet. Yeah. I think he's the closest we've got to being on the same level as Neruda in some ways, in the sense that he broke the mould with his anti-poesia, anti-poema, and his voice is unique in the same way that Neruda were. But again, he was writing against Neruda, not with him. Nobody would call themselves an heir. They would not admit. So I don't think there are any. But that's not to say, as I said, there are some very fine poets writing today. But it's very hard trying to escape from underneath this enormous Neruda-shaped shadow. He was a big man. He wobbled around. He liked his food, so it made him a very big shadow to escape. There are no heirs, but we go back to Nascimento. We go back to the man that brought this all about. Neruda, I think, was always grateful for being given that start in life. Most people do need it. Most poets, if you look through their history, there's this one person, this one figure who stands out. Either a mentor or a publisher in this case, someone who's willing to take the gamble. And the poets look back, or any artist, they look back and they say, if it weren't for that person, I would not be where I am today.